Insight on the policy blueprint. We're joined now live by Dan McClory. He's the head of China at Burnham Securities Incorporated. And Dan, let's get right to some of these outcomes. Chinese top leaders say they want to maintain economic growth in a reasonable range. And we've seen the Chinese government cast growth targets in the past. Now we're hearing this term reasonable range. What's the significance of that?
Well, thanks for having me on the show, Jessica. I think it shows that China wants to continue to control the controllables and to keep expectations within a range. China is starting to become much more experienced at the messaging and the signaling that's taking place. And as we heard earlier in the show, somewhere in the 6.5% to 7% range is probably the significance of that number, because as we know, China needs to average 6.5% in the decade between 2010 and 2020 to double their GDP, which is a stated goal of the government.
Now, we're also seeing a change in the way the Chinese government talks about what it's going to do on spending and taxes and what the actions of the central bank will be. They're really looking for more flexibility, it seems. For example, last year, the focus was on balance in terms of what the central bank. Now there's a little more wiggle room, a focus on flexibility from them. What do you make of that?
Again, I make from that China is attempting to put the world and economic observers on notice that they are fully aware and somewhat in control of which knobs need to be turned to aid in this rebalancing of the economy. After last summer and the meltdown in the financial markets and some of the criticism that China faced for being reactive and attempting what seemed to be forced solution after another, I think China is now putting the world on notice that they have a number of different items at their disposal that they can adjust. And as we heard earlier, the whole supply side adjustments is something new. We've talked about increasing consumption, but now China is recognizing that some of these efficiencies just aren't there, and they need to address that part of the equation as well.
And one of the areas they're really honing in on is housing. They've got 690 million square meters of empty housing right now in China. Why is it so important to the economy to fill those properties? And do you have a sense that keeping lower interest rates across the board will impact that at this point?
Well, the reason for the importance is a convergence of two factors. One is that you've got the urban to rural migration, and if in any way that can be assisted by this housing availability, then you're meeting one major policy and national goal. But the second is there needs to be some delevering of the property sector. And to answer your question about adjustments in interest rates having an effect, I think we're going to see more of an effect at what I would call the wholesale level. So the developers who have bet long and have bet hard on housing inventories, many of whom have faced financial difficulties, they can see a little bit of relief from reduced rates. But as we're all aware, Chinese consumers are incredible savers, and they pay for the most part in cash when they buy housing. So I think you're going to see that uplift coming at the development level as opposed to at the consumer level, with a huge catalyst for taking down that inventory, mainly being some breathing room for developers.
So this is how you think that there'll be more emphasis on moving people from rural areas to urban areas, right?
That certainly plays into the policy narrative. It reminds me of several years back when I was speaking with John Huntsman, who was the former U.S. ambassador to China, and he was having his exit interview with Hu Jintao. And Mr. Huntsman was complimenting Mr. Hu Jintao about all the progress that's been made in China with economic reform and GDP growth, and that being the envy of a lot of the world, and especially the U.S. And Hu Jintao remarked to Mr. Huntsman, "Be careful what you wish for. I've got 800,000 farmers that somehow need to find their way ultimately into cities. This is the greatest rural to urban migration in the history of the planet." So we've got our challenges, and I think now we're seeing maybe some creative ways to address and face those challenges.
And certainly there are challenges that every economy faces. You alluded earlier to the volatility we saw in the stock market in China over the summer. And I wonder, we've already seen mainland stocks react really positively, the highest finish in nearly a month on the mainland. How do you think this is going to play in Western markets, European markets, and American markets tomorrow?
I think they will react favorably as well. And this is in sharp contrast, again, to what would be seen as the reactive signaling and messaging that took place over the summer. I definitely put all this in the category of proactive. And I think it's part of the bigger narrative, Jessica, where China, because of its ascension to the special drawing rights as a world reserve currency, and because of its inclusion of its U.S.-listed Chinese stocks in the MSCI indices, now sees that it has global responsibility for that leadership position, and they're acting accordingly.
You know, and I think this is something we've talked about before. The challenge that you mentioned earlier in your story that Hun Jintao was alluding to is that this is an economy that has to grow very fast, and it's promised to grow very fast while doing these reforms. And it looks like, in terms of reducing industrial capacity, how does that growth target really impact the choices that China has in that area?
Well, you're making an excellent point, which is people tend to forget that these extremely high rates of growth that China is for the most part maintaining and sustaining are happening in the face of a massive rebalancing of the economy. And that focus has been on changing from manufacturing to services, changing from infrastructure investment to consumption. And now Beijing is standing back and looking and saying, you know, we can become a lot more efficient. There is a lot of reform that can be accomplished in overcapacity, in state-owned enterprises, for example. We've been working exclusively with a fund based in Beijing called Bohai Harvest Rosemont, and they are targeting SOE reform as a major investing theme to attract foreign dollars into China to help China through that transition, where now some 2/3 of China's economy are based on the private sector, and maybe 1/3 is based on the state-owned enterprise sector, and that's seen as a major opportunity in coming years.
I think we just got a little bit of a tip from you there. Thanks for joining us, Dan McClory, head of China at Burnham Securities. We appreciate your time.